Hola, World History. Bienvenidos a día tres. Welcome to day three, World History. We're going to continue talking about borders. For today and tomorrow, we're going to be focusing today, day three, and then tomorrow, day four, we're going to be focusing on the Berlin Wall um, as a case study for borders. So it's going to be split up into 2 days. For today, you're going to start with the do now, and then there are going to be two checks for understanding. Okay. You're going to be doing research next week that's going to ask you to look at a border of your choice. We'll give you options. Like this presentation, what I'm going to do today and tomorrow, yours is going to be similar. You're also going to be asked to detail the history of a border and discuss the social, economic, and political impacts of the border. I'm going to be doing that today and tomorrow for the Berlin Wall. You're going to be doing that when you do research next week. For that reason, I want you to pay close attention to how I discuss the history of the Berlin Wall, the economic and social political impacts of the wall. Okay. So you're going to start with your day three do now. I want you to think about if the county of San Mateo were to build a wall along Alameda de las Pulgas, dividing Hillsdale High School from the mall, Caltrain station, etc. What do you think? What do you think it was like to live in a city divided by a physical wall? What would you do about getting to school? Seeing your friends, going to the mall, or traveling somewhere? What risk would you take to cross to the other side? So, this is a theoretical scenario that's getting us thinking about the Berlin Wall. Okay, so you're going to take a few minutes to look at and answer the prompt. Okay, so we're going to start with our first objective for today. Objective number one is that you're going to be able to explain what is the Berlin Wall and why it was created. Um, in order for you to understand the Berlin Wall and why it was created, you're going to need some background information on the Cold War in order to understand the history. So I'm going to go over that briefly next. So the Cold War took place from 1945 to 1992. Um, it was a period of immense tension between the USSR, otherwise known as the Soviet Union, and the US in the decades following World War II. So it just kind of set up two superpowers that were in disagreement with each other about how they should proceed in Europe. There was an ideological conflict between communist dictatorships and capitalist governments. Some of the capitalist governments were democracies, others were dictatorships. The USSR was communist, and the US is considered a capitalist government. The ideological contest had to do with the with distrust between communism and capitalist ideas and what each believed was the best form of government. So because their ideas and goals were drastically different, they're kind of opposites of each other. They saw each other as a threat, and because they saw each other as a threat, there was a lot of distrust between both governments. Um, it was also an international struggle between many countries and groups who took sides in this quote war. And it was a Cold War. The idea that it's a Cold War is the idea that it's not actually a war, it's cold. No one is actually fighting. Or at least the two powers aren't fighting each other because other countries did fight each other. So after World War II, as countries were rebuilding or seeking independence from colonizers, and we kind of briefly talked about that yesterday with India. India would be an example. Countries like India had to make decisions about what government and economic system their countries would adopt. So, because of that, they had to choose sides. And the same thing ended up happening in Europe. Okay. So the tensions were created by the outcome of World War II. So on one side, right, the U.S. They were now the world's richest and most powerful nation. They suffered minor amounts of casualties, um, and there was no damage done. Sorry, to national infrastructure. There was only an attack on U.S. The only attack on U.S. soil was on a remote military island. So because of these factors, the U.S. came out really strong with a strong economy, and they hadn't lost much compared to other countries in Europe and compared to the Soviet Union, which after World War II was the second most powerful nation. They suffered more casualties than all other nations combined. If you remember the documentary that we watched when we were studying World War II, right, there was that graphic that showed the amount of Soviet soldiers and civilians that died in the Soviet Union. The documentary was The Fallen. Um, and many Soviet cities were completely destroyed. Remember that they were bombed, and Stalin also sacrificed a lot of the cities. Um, so, although Russia was a powerful country, they also were kind of fearful of what other European countries could do if they were to rise. And I'll go over that next. Okay. um, so the U.S. Was influence. They had influence in Western Europe. Um, they believed in a system of capitalism where private interests and corporations drive economic activity. They held or hold free elections with citizen representations, with the idea that people are able to choose their leaders. Um, and in the U.S., individual rights are supposed to be respected through free speech, press, and worship. Right. So you see that all of these three things work together. Okay. On the other side, the ideology, the idea was different, right? So after World War II, the USSR, the Soviet Union, had influence in Eastern Europe. If we'll look at a map later, but Eastern Europe is where the Soviet Union shares a border with Europe. And because of that, when they were coming in, that's the area that the Soviet Union took over. Um, the Soviet Union had a system of communism where the state controls all economic activity and there's no private property. The idea is that the government controls the means of production, and they control work, labor, and they're supposed to make the decisions to distribute the things that are produced. So there isn't uh, a strong emphasis on private interests. They also have or tend to have, at least in the Soviet Union, they had a totalitarian leader, right? And we've learned about and talked about Stalin. They have limited rights, and there's no freedom of the press or worship. Okay. So these two systems, these two governments, these two countries, the US and the Soviet Union, are opposites of each other in the ideas in how they function. Okay. Um, okay. So then the other thing I forgot to go over, which I'm going to go over quickly, was that as militaries were overtaking German controlled areas, the advancing armies took control over these areas, which is why the US had influence in Western Europe, and which is why the Soviet Union, the USSR, had influence in Eastern Europe. Okay. And then the other thing is that the US, they wanted all European countries to hold free elections and ensure that a capitalist system would be set up in the European countries where they had control. And they also wanted to make sure that European countries sided with the U.S. Okay, and then this is kind of getting back to the idea of distrust. The U.S. felt like it needed those European countries to hold back the Soviet Union, which was strong in Europe. The USSR, on the other hand, they wanted to make sure that the governments that were set up were communists and sided with the Soviet Union. So again, they felt like they were going to have to prepare to defend themselves against the capitalist countries, which is why when they were taking over Eastern Europe, they wanted to make sure that these countries that they were taking over would remain communist. Yeah. Um, so why did this happen to Germany? Okay, so Germany, as they were surrendering to the advancing armies, it was divided into four sectors, and then it was eventually divided down to two sectors. The West was controlled by the U.S., and the East was controlled by the Soviets. Okay, so here is a map, right? The east is here. So this is a map of Germany. The eastern part was controlled by the Soviet Union. The western part was controlled by the three other powers: France, Britain, and the U.S. Okay. Eventually, Western Germany was unified. So Western Germany, after France, Britain, and the U.S. left, Western Germany was unified into one country. Okay? And then Eastern Germany ended up remained communist. And so then there was a creation of two different countries: Western Germany and Eastern Germany. And we'll go over Berlin next because the focus of our border is the Berlin Wall. Okay, and then here is Berlin. Okay, I'm going to pause here. Okay, so we left off with the Berlin blockade, which I'm going to go over next. Um, and then the Berlin blockade ends up taking place between June 24th, 1948, and May 12th, 1949. So by 1948, the US, France, and Britain were going to pull out of areas that they controlled, and they were going to combine them so that it would be combined into one nation, right? So these three areas would all be part of Western Germany. The Soviets didn't like this idea and decided to take Western Berlin hostage. And you see that Western Berlin is here. Western Berlin was inside of East Germany, even though Berlin was split up. Part of it was controlled by the Soviets, and the other part was controlled by the US, France, and Britain. Um, okay, so the Soviets didn't like that West Germany was going to be unified, so they decided to take Western Berlin hostage by cutting off all ground access to it. As a result, the only way into Berlin was by air. So you can see here, right? If the Soviet Union was going to block it off, there was no way for any resources to get in to Western Berlin. Okay, and then some of the reasons why the Soviet Union was upset that Western Germany was unifying was that the Soviet Union wanted to keep Germany weak. The Soviet Union had experienced in history. They had been attacked by a strong Germany twice, right? Once during World War I, and then again during World War II. So, for security concerns, the Soviet Union's goal was to keep Germany weak. Um, okay, so there's a blockade that is set up in Berlin that's keeping resources from entering Western Berlin. So the Soviet Union responds by holding Western Berlin hostage. They cut off the highway, water, rail traffic into Berlin's western zones, since nothing could get in the city. The city people who lived in Western Berlin faced starvation. Um, okay, so the Berlin blockade. Um, So even though Berlin was in the Soviet area, Berlin was divided into four zones, which was shown in the map and that I went over earlier. So Stalin thought that he could get the U.S. to surrender Western Berlin with the blockade. He thought that they would have no other option but to surrender Berlin and give it up to the Soviet Union. But it turned out that he was wrong. For 11 months, Britain and the U.S. airlifted food and supplies into Berlin. Um, okay. So from June 1948 to May 1949, there were 278,000 flights that brought 2.3 million tons of food, fuel, and medicine to the citizens of West Berlin, right? And you might be asking, why didn't the US just give up Western Berlin? It's a small part. Well, the reason is that, right, the US would seem weak if they gave it up, or they had this idea that the Soviet Unions would consider them weak and might try to do other things in other countries. So they felt it was important to support Western Berlin and not allow it to be a part of or to have the Soviet Union get its way and gain Western Berlin. Okay. Okay. So, what is the border is going to be our next focus, because we're focusing on borders. So now you have some background on the Cold War and Berlin. So we're going to shift back to our focus on what is the border. Okay. So our next focus is what was the Berlin Wall. Okay. So before the wall was set up, people could travel freely between East and West Berlin. And then again, remember that East Berlin and East Germany was controlled by the Soviet Union, and West Berlin was controlled by the U.S., France, and Britain. But it was inside of East Germany. During this time, there were 3.5 million Eastern Germans who defected. To defect just means to leave an area, to choose to leave an area. So they left the Soviet-controlled East Germany by going to West Berlin, where they could then move freely to West Germany or other European countries. So people were choosing to leave East Berlin because they had a border and they could go into West Berlin, and there wasn't any protection of the border. Okay. But on August 13th, 1961, the communist government of the German Democratic Republic began to use barbed wire and concrete slabs to build a wall to divide East and West Berlin. And I don't want you to get confused. This German Democratic Republic, that was the name of the Eastern German government. They were communist, but they refer to themselves as the Democratic Republic. Okay. So a barrier was over 500,000 feet long, and it was only about 140,000 feet was the physical wall. Um, and the wall was set up to stop Eastern Germans from leaving. Okay, so it started off as just barbed wire and concrete, but it evolved into two concrete walls with a death strip in the middle. It was similar to No Man's Land, if you remember that from World War One. There were watch towers and armed guards, bunkers, electric fences, dog patrols. These things were all set up to prevent people from leaving Eastern Germany. You might ask, why would people want to leave Eastern Berlin or Eastern Germany? Well, remember that the Soviet Union wanted to keep Germany weak. So they were making sure that their economy wouldn't improve or improve rapidly or fast compared to Western Germany, where in Western Germany, the US, Britain, and France wanted Germany to get strong. And so their economy in Western Germany was stronger. Okay. There were 55,000 landmines set up in this death strip. Okay. So here is a modern picture. This is an exhibit that is or has been set up after the wall was torn down. I think they left this behind um, as a relic or for people to remember. Okay. But this is the setup of the Berlin Wall. Okay, so here you have West Germany, which is united, and then on this side, right, you have East Germany, which was communist, controlled by the Soviet Union, and then you have Berlin. This is a city that is also split up. Part of it was West Berlin, and then the other part was Berlin. So there was a wall. Berlin Wall was built around West Berlin, so that East Germans could not flee or leave East Berlin for West Germany. Um, so there was an outer wall that was set up, um, and you see the outer wall here. This is West Berlin. An outer wall is set up here. This was called the death strip. It's the area between the inner and outer wall. It was covered with soft sand, and would show footprints of escape attempts. Only the most trusted soldiers were allowed to access this area. We also see spike mats set up here. There's a vehicle ditch. There's also tank traps. Okay. There's a watchtower set up here. The watchtower was where guard posts were staffed around the clock by 2 to 5 soldiers who had an uninterrupted view of the borderline. Okay, there's a guard road set up here, and it was a concrete pathway that allowed patrolling soldiers to move swiftly along the border. So that's set up there. There's also a signal fence. A signal fence with barbed wire span concrete posts. Anyone trying to climb the fence would press wires together, completing a circuit and tripping in electrical output. Okay, so just electrify people. Um, so you see an example here, right? There's a concrete post, barbed wire is set up. I went over the watchtower. Back to this, and then you have your rear wall set up here. This is a rear wall. This was the first barrier on the east side, barring entry to the border zone. It was as high as 10 foot high. Okay, so that's set up here, and there's 2 walls set up. And then this would be East Berlin. They're trying to prevent East Berliners from entering West Berlin. Okay. So the question that we're going to be thinking about is, do we think this is a physical or a political border, or is it both? You're going to do your check for understanding, and you're answering the question, do you think the Berlin Wall was a physical or political border? Could it be both? Explain. Provide details, please. Okay. So, it was a physical border. It was literally a wall of concrete and fencing. So it was a man-made wall that was intended to keep groups of people apart, and it separated 2 cities. It separated Eastern and Western Berlin, and you could also argue that it separated 2 countries, right? It separated Eastern Germany from Western Germany. Yeah. So it's a physical border, man-made wall, but it's also a political border. It divides different economic and political systems. So it was a system that was intentionally set up to separate communist government, where they had where the government controlled the economy. The border separated it from a capitalist government that allowed individuals, businesses, and corporations to control the economy. So it's both a physical border and a political border, right? Separating Western capitalist Berlin from Eastern communist Berlin. Why was the wall created? I briefly went over this earlier, but I'm going to go over it again. So the wall was created because East Germany was much poorer than West Germany. They also had a lot of labor strikes due to the new economy and political system. It was a communist government. So it was focused on the workers, and it gave workers a lot of rights and opportunities to strike. And because of that, it was one of the reasons why it made it difficult for East Germany to develop a strong economy. And then there was also the issue, right, that the Soviet Union controlled East Germany and they wanted to keep Germany weak. Because of that, East Berliners began fleeing to West Berlin. There were approximately 1,700 people leaving East Germany per day. 3 million East Germans went to West Germany through Berlin between 1949 and 1961. So there's a lot of East Germans leaving. Um, you have an image, right? There's a wall set up or a fence set up, but it isn't enforced or as strongly enforced as it was after the Berlin Wall was set up. Okay. So why was the wall created? It was created to stop people from fleeing to West Berlin, which created a brain drain and a loss of workers in East Berlin. Right? If people with a lot of skills, talents, people who can work are leaving, then it would and did create a lot of issues for East Berlin. And because of that, they um, ended up deciding to set up a border to prevent people from leaving. Okay, so your check for understanding, your second one, Berlin Wall basic facts. I want you to answer a few questions. One, what was the Berlin Wall? Two, why was the wall built? And then three, I want you to predict why would people try to escape? What would happen to people who tried to escape? And then if you have questions, you can include them. I'm going to try to include a space for you to ask any questions that you may have. See you tomorrow.